The world of Dungeons & Dragons is full of magic. Not only spells and items that characters can use for their power, but also creatures, beasts, and monsters that your players might fight or befriend. In this video, we're going to talk about familiars. We're going to talk about how you, as a player or dungeon master, can use them to get the most out of your game. Familiars are magical spirits that characters of arcane talent can bind to a form and bring into their service. There's a few classes that can get and command familiars, but for now we're just going to focus on the wizard. The wizard is the main class that is known for spending the time to study the rituals needed to summon familiars to this plane. Now let's quickly take a look at the Find Familiar spell. You gain the service of a familiar, a spirit that takes an animal form you choose. I'll skip over the descriptions of the animals available. It appears in an unoccupied space within range. The familiar has the statistics of the chosen form, though it is a celestial, fey, or fiend. Your choice instead of a beast. Your familiar acts independently of you, but it always obeys your commands. In combat, it rolls its own initiative and acts on its own turn. A familiar can't attack, but it can take other actions as normal. When the familiar drops to 0 hit points, it disappears, leaving behind no physical form. It reappears after you cast the spell again. When your familiar is within 100 feet of you, you can communicate with it telepathically. Additionally, as an action, you can see through your familiar's eyes and hear what it hears until the start of your next turn, gaining the benefits of any special senses that the familiar has, like dark vision. During this time, you are deaf and blind with regard to your own senses. As an action, you can temporarily dismiss your familiar. It disappears into a pocket dimension where it awaits your summons. Alternatively, you can dismiss it forever. As an action, while it is temporarily dismissed, you can cause it to reappear in any unoccupied space within 30 feet of you. You can't have more than one familiar at a time. If you cast a spell while you already have a familiar, you instead cause it to adopt a new form. Finally, when you cast a spell within a range of touch, your familiar can deliver the spell as if it had cast the spell. Your familiar must be within 100 feet of you, and it must use its reaction to deliver the spell when you cast it. If the spell requires an attack roll, you use your own attack modifier for the roll. Alright, so let's break down what we just read. There's a few things that are really interesting that I think players often ignore when using familiars that can really enhance your role-playing experience. First, what kind of spirit is your familiar? The spell specifies celestial, fey, or fiend, but in most of the games I've played, that doesn't seem to be a huge part of the experience of having a familiar. Don't just ignore it. We tend to just focus on the form, whether your familiar is an owl or a cat or some sort of octopus, but the origin of your familiar, whether it's celestial, fey, fiend, or even primordial or elemental, if you want to go a different route and make those options available to your players, those can be really interesting, and they can define a lot of how your familiar behaves, and can be interesting story hooks for the player that commands that familiar later on. It's an easy way to add depth to the familiar itself. Remember, a familiar is an NPC too. The player controls its actions, but it has its own agency, and even if it's a spirit, it's sentient enough to follow the commands its master gives it and communicate with the player telepathically. That leads us into another important part. Personality. Is your familiar curious? Is it mischievous? Is it loyal and ardent? Is it shy? Don't just think about how you can use your familiar. Think about your familiar as a character, and if you're a dungeon master, encourage your players to think about their familiars this way too. Remember, this is an eternal companion. As long as your player is using the spell, it's usually bringing back the same spirit. Even when it dies, it's just the form that's destroyed. The spirit gets sent back to whatever plane it comes from, and the next time you cast the spell, that same spirit gets drawn forward into either a new form or the same form you had it inhabit before. While you're thinking about what kind of familiar your character might have, I think it's important to also take into consideration your own character. A wizard might have discovered the ritual in a spellbook, learning it in school or having it passed down to them. Maybe the familiar spirit's been with their family for generations, maybe it's been lost. Who knows what the story is? You and your player can come up with that together. But the flavor of a wizard who has a familiar might be different from a different class who has a familiar. For example, the bard, the arcane trickster rogue, or the eldritch knight fighter can all gain access to the arcane familiar spell. It's possible that your eldritch knight fighter might find the same ritual spell and connect to the same spirit that a wizard might, but it doesn't have to be true. You can decide that maybe the fighter finds a more combative spirit, Or the arcane trickster rogue finds a more cunning one. Maybe the spirit the bard connects to is super shy, making for an interesting contrast between the typically outgoing bards and the really shy familiar spirit that the bard now has under their command. Of course, there's one other major class that can do a lot with the familiar that we haven't talked about: the warlock. And really, the wizard and the warlock are the main places that you see familiars used because they're already built right into how the classes function. Players don't have to go out of their way to gain access to a familiar using these classes. Well, they don't have to go too far out of their way. Meow meow. I don't know if you guys can hear that, but that's my familiar over there hanging out. This is my familiar. I'm deathly allergic to him, but he's great. Yep, hello. Unfortunately, we can't communicate telepathically, though he does meow a lot, so I guess he's trying. Alright, back to business. The warlock. The warlock familiar is very similar to the wizard familiar, but there are two main differences. First, in addition to the normal forms a wizard familiar has access to, the warlock familiar has access to special forms that the spirit they bind can turn into. In the player's handbook, they're the imp, the quasit, the sprite, and the pseudo-dragon. There are no restrictions around what kind of familiar you can have based off the patron that you choose. Instead, it's solely determined by whether or not you take the Pact of the Chain feature at level 3, which allows you to command a familiar. Of course, some familiars fit the flavor of some otherworldly patrons better than others, but it's all up to you in the end. For example, maybe if your otherworldly patron is the Fiend, they could have slaughtered a celestial that was trying to undo their efforts a long time ago. And when that celestial was injured and bound, it became much weaker than before, little more than a spirit. Now that spirit is bound to your cause by the Pact of the Chain. It is there to serve you, an eternal prisoner to the Fiend patron. I think that's a pretty cool idea. Second important difference. When you take the attack action, you can forgo one of your attacks to instead allow your familiar to make an attack of their own. When you combine this with the benefits of these special forms, which tend to be a little tougher and more substantial, either CR 1/4 or CR 1, compared to the CR 0 or CR 1/8 wizard familiars, it can pack a pretty powerful punch. Now, there's something a lot of people get wrong that I want to make sure to talk about: the variant familiar question. There's a feature called Variant Familiar. If you want to take a look at it, you can find it for the imp on page 70 of the monster manual. I'm going to take a second just to read to you. Imps can be found in the service to mortal spellcasters, acting as advisors, spies, and familiars. Some such imps have the following trait. Familiar. The imp can enter into a contract to serve their master as a familiar, forming a telepathic bond with its willing master. While the two are bonded, the master can sense what the imp senses as long as they are within 1 mile of each other. While the imp is within 10 feet of its master, the master shares the imp's magic resistance trait. If its master violates the terms of the contract, the imp can end its service as a familiar, ending the telepathic bond. Alright, so how do people get this wrong? Well, if you bind your familiar through the Find Familiar spell or the Pact of the Chain, you don't have access to that. That's because the Variant Familiar feature only applies if your familiar is actually an imp. In your case, your familiar is actually a spirit that has taken the form of an imp. So your familiar is not the actual creature itself, meaning you don't benefit from the variant feature. If you're a dungeon master or if you're a player who really wants an imp, you can always do things your own way. I personally would have no problem with a player actually taking on an imp as their familiar. I think it could lead to some really cool story directions, and I think that it all balances out because they have to trade off the flexibility of their magical familiar for the additional power that an imp gets. Hopefully you understand how familiars work a little bit better now, and you understand how you might be able to use them to flesh out your role-playing. I want to talk about some other ways you can actually use your familiars mechanically in the game, and not just in the roleplay interactions that you have. As important as a personality and origin is for your familiar, there's always those 3 pillars, right? Roleplay, combat, and exploration. So far, we've only talked about roleplay. So, let's talk about this no attacking thing. Even the Pact of the Chain has restrictions on attacking. However, even if your familiar can't attack, there are other ways you can use it to be effective in combat. The help action is an easy one. It's great both in exploration and in combat because you can use it to grant yourself advantage on an ability check, or if your creature is within reach of the target enemy, you can use it to grant yourself advantage on an attack roll by having your familiar distract the target creature or just get in their way. But remember, you can also use your familiar to interact with the environment. You don't have to always just simply use the help action. Be creative about how you're approaching your combat scenarios. For example, recently in a game, I had an enemy that was disarmed and dropped their weapon. One of the players ordered their familiar to pick up the weapon and run away with it. Doing something like that is well within the means of any animal, as long as the weapon isn't a massive greatsword. Keeping an enemy away from their weapon in this way is a great way to ensure that disarming them is more than just a simple nuisance they can fix in one turn. If your familiar can fly, you can also have it drop stuff on your enemies. That's one way that I would also allow that to be justified as the help action, but if you happen to have any acid, or perhaps some dynamite, or another useful explosive, bombs away. That's not an attack roll. It's totally fair for you to do that, of course as long as your DM allows it. But I think they should. Who whispers like this? But I think they should. And of course, there's scouting. Now, a lot of people complain that familiars are overpowered scouts, especially Warlock Familiars. But they're supposed to be. That's what they're designed for. Your players picked this ability, this feature, instead of another feature. Allow them to feel good with it. Don't worry about the fact that they're bypassing your traps. If they can do it reasonably, let them. It's up to you to come up with creative ways to challenge them and provide new obstacles for them to face. If they're getting past all the ones that you're already designing, you need to either reevaluate what you're letting your players get away with, or come up with new challenges that they haven't experienced yet. If you're perceiving through your familiar senses, things might look a little different for your player characters. A flying familiar might not notice a tripwire or pressure plate. A small familiar skittering on the floor might not notice enemies hanging from the ceiling. But in any case, them getting past and succeeding against the challenges that you're confronting them with, whether they're bypassing them entirely or actually defeating them, that's their reward for using the features they've decided to build their character around. It might not seem as fulfilling in combat, and I know it's frustrating when a combat encounter you thought would be very exciting ends up getting resolved in 10 minutes because the players just have another way to solve it. But that's such a good feeling for your players. And ultimately, D&D is about having a good time, and making sure your players are feeling good about their ability to contribute to the game is a great way to ensure that happens. And to that end, I want to talk about one last thing, something that you can do if you find that the familiar has become a really important part of one of your players' experience and you want to let that relationship grow and develop for the character over time. Allow the player to, through certain feats within the story or whatever effort that they make, allow them to unlock superior forms for their familiar, or allow them to give it magical boons. Tie it to the character's role-playing experience and story so that anything they get feels earned. It's all so much better that way. Be careful not to overshadow any other pet character class. Keep everything fair and equitable. Familiars are not usually a huge part of a spellcasting character's combat abilities, whereas pets can be a pretty big part of what other classes can do. I don't think there's that much wrong with your characters being overpowered in relation to the world, but they shouldn't be too overpowered in relation to each other. At the end, D&D is just about having a good time, and hopefully, these familiar rules and this explanation about how familiar works help you do that. Alright, as always, I'm Jeremy Malul. This has been Experience Gain. The goal of the series is to help you, whether you're a player or dungeon master, get the most out of your games. Until next time.